the sumptuous private chamber of the Viceroy. "Was I emphatic enough, Captain?" demanded the Viceroy. Tiny cups of tea and plates of cakes and sweetmeats were already set out. "Entirely, Your Excellency. You gave those clowns the worst 5 minutes of their lives." The informal audience was soon over, and Wang grasped Merewether's hand in farewell. "I shall send you back to your ship in the Admiral's barge, as befits my captain of the fleet. My counting-house has made an appraisal of your share of the prize money earned in our cruise against Madame Ching and her pirates, and the silver is in the chests already loaded. My gratitude, Captain, and farewell." It was in the forenoon watch next day when the barge came alongside Comet and the chests were hoisted out to be deposited in Macrae's strong-room. Before they went in, Merewether opened one of them to see the stacks of gleaming tails. There must be close to 20,000 English pounds here, he estimated with a whistle. It was only fair, he decided, that Comet have a 1/6 share in recognition of its services against the first pirate squadron. But he would deal with that matter later. He had other fish to fry over in Macao. If he called away the gig now, he might intercept Creusa before siesta. Running wing and wing before the steady pressure of the northeast monsoon, Comet was already nearing the approaches to the Strait of Malacca at dusk of the 4th day out of Macao. Merewether came on deck after the leisurely meal with Macrae to stand at the taffrail and enjoy the cooling breeze. He was glad to be quit of China again, though his sojourn there had been immensely profitable and his services to the Mandarin Wang, now Viceroy of Canton, had saved the company's trade. But there were other events of which he was not proud. He had violated his vows of a year and a half ago to Caroline, and would have done it again and again, except for the fortuitous turn of events. He brushed the matter aside. He could not put the guilt out of his soul, but he might ignore it for a time until he could come to grips with his conscience and settle on the penance he must do. His thoughts shifted to Drury, that very proper naval officer who believed that man had no higher calling than to serve as a king's officer, and bore himself accordingly. The Admiral had raised no objection to the request to proceed independently to Calcutta, the necessity of making his report to the Governor-General at the earliest possible moment being apparent. Once the order was signed, Drury had leaned back and looked at him quizzically. "Captain, I'll be honest with you. I entertain some rather dark suspicions as to who may be responsible for giving me the fright of my life at Canton some days ago." Merewether strove to keep his face impassive, remembering the Admiral's expression when the charges from the 2 cohorns plunged into the water close aboard either side of the barge. "Why," he began tentatively, wondering if a clean breast of the matter was the best way out. "Never mind. It's just that I saw a Chinese in the group on the junk who bore a scar greatly resembling yours. Of course, I know that you had no motive to take any such reprisal against me, so I give the credit in my report to that harsh young man who claimed to be the Viceroy, and, being fired upon while seeking a parley of peace, somewhat enlivens an otherwise dry narrative." "Get out on this note," Merewether decided. "I'm sure you must be correct in your surmise, sir. The new Viceroy, the Mandarin Wang, is a resolute young man of many accomplishments, and quite capable of giving such an order. And now, sir, I propose to get under way at once in the hope of getting well clear of land before dark." "I wish you good fortune, Captain. Your services have been admirable, and while I could hardly care less about the company's fortunes, I credit you with preserving for the time its trade to Canton." Admiral Drury had risen and extended his hand in dismissal. Now, with the sun sinking below the horizon and the second dog-watch skylarking on deck in the few minutes left before it relieved the first, a less agreeable recollection came back to haunt him as he saw young Marlowe come up the companion preparatory to assuming his duty as junior to Dillon. Merewether turned his head and stared at the horizon so as not to have to meet his gaze. It was yet painful to look upon that cherubic, downy, guileless, adolescent countenance, knowing that behind that 16-year-old face must lurk the sophisticated worldly experience of a Don Juan or Giacomo Casanova. He was not proud of the part he had played that single night in the summer-house with Creusa, but he had excused himself with the thought that she had been attracted to him, had indeed sought him out, had enchanted him and made him forget his vows to Caroline. Now he told himself that it was no more than rough justice that he had been deprived of her charms after the one encounter, but his pride was touched none the less. He had hurried ashore that day he returned from Canton, not even taking the time to count his prize money, arriving at the landing just after noon. With the evacuation in progress, it had taken time to commandeer transportation. He could not arrive for his rendezvous dusty and sweating, but he was at the guest-house before 1 o'clock to be met by Sang with a salam at the door. He dissembled with his Indian steward, suddenly uncomfortable and a bit embarrassed, but yet intent upon the assignation. "Mr. Marlowe?" he inquired. "The occupation is over, Sang, and you must pack for the move back aboard Comet." "Sir, Mr. Marlowe is taking siesta." "Well, wake him up." Astounding how quickly subordinates acquired the customs of the country if advantageous to them. "But, sir, he takes it elsewhere." "What?" Sang's small, sad countenance was averted, hands clasped before his chest, evidently ill at ease, reluctant to speak. "Out with it, Sang. Where is he?" "Sir, since the day after you left, he has spent each afternoon with the woman, Mrs. Hale, in her apartment in the commandant's house." The news sunk in. Merewether closed his mouth, thankful that Sang had kept his gaze averted. Then he felt a surge of raw anger rise in his throat. Pluck that presumptuous puppy up by the scruff of the neck and cast him out. He stood silent a moment as the realities of the situation sunk in. He could not create a scene, make a scandal. If nothing worse, he would be the laughing-stock of the Marines, supplanted by a beardless boy. The anger faded, leaving him limp and spent for a moment, before he forced himself to speak. "Indeed," he said, striving to keep his tone light, "we would be less than chivalrous to intrude upon Madame Hale at such a moment. Pack his kit and both of you be on board Comet tonight." Merewether rowed back to the landing, passing the field guns and Cassians rattling along, feeling no particular emotion, mind almost blank, but contrarily a little thankful that the liaison had not proved out. He passed the company residence, wondering idly if Tulsi Bai yet sojourned there, but did not look up, now with only a crimson glow in the sky to mark the vanished sun. He felt embarrassed and remorseful at the recollection. He would make it up to Caroline. He would request the 3 years' leave to which he was entitled, and take her back to England to be reunited with that other man's child. He felt the weight lift as he went below. The clatter of iron tires on cobblestones attracted Tulsi Bai's attention, and she left off her packing to peer again through the curtains into the street. She hoped it was not Patty returning, for she could no longer abide the thought of the man. Another hour and she would be quit of him forever. All her persuasion and wiles had not sufficed to divert him from his effort to intercept the opium cargo that meant another fortune for Renée and the judge. Actually, she had never dreamed that company cruiser out there would find the needle in the haystack of the approaches to Macao and Canton. But it had, and they had lost $500,000 counting the profit. Of course, the out-of-pocket loss was less than 1/5 of that amount, but her fortunes had not improved out here. Any further trade was gone for the nonce as well. That young viceroy in Canton had swept with a new broom. The complacent functionaries who had shared in the illicit profits had been replaced with clever men who were also incorruptible. Time would probably change that, but for the present René and the judge must needs write off their losses and retire from the traffic. Patty and his amatory accomplishments had palled on Tulsi as soon as she saw his elation over the ruin Comet had brought to her brother's venture. A ship would depart for Goa 3 days hence, and her passage was already booked. Once there, she might again test the political climate at Rajputana, and she doubted that Holkar's vengeance would reach so far. High time to set in motion again her intrigues to put Melhar on the throne. She pulled aside the curtain. It was that scar-faced captain again, just passing below in his carriage, oblivious of her presence here above. Madame Bai's reaction was instinctive and instantaneous. She spat. A vagrant eddy in the still air carried the glob of spittle to land squarely between Merewether's shoulder blades, a dark spot on the blue coat, dried and nearly invisible by the time he reached the landing, all unconscious of the insult. Tulsi returned to her packing in almost a cheerful humour. Merewether sat in the rattan easy-chair with his book held so as to catch the light from the lamp here in the dingy lodgings in Calcutta. He stared intently at the printed page, but his thoughts were far away. Caroline sat across the little table, peering near-sightedly at the stitches she was taking in a tiny garment for Robert. She did not care for sewing, but she had felt compelled to demonstrate her maternal affection by making at least one item for her son's wardrobe. Her eyes were still a little pink from the tears of an hour ago. He must make a decision, Merewether told himself. He had returned from Macao 2 days ago to find Caroline in the depths of despondency, grieving again for her son in England. He recalled the half-promise he had made her 1.5 years ago, when he had told her that after 10 years of commissioned service he would be entitled to 3 years' leave with pay. But he still felt a small flush of jealousy at her affection for that other man's son. And he was finding it difficult to carry out the resolve made as penance for his misdeeds at Macao 3 months ago. Still staring blindly at the printed page, his thoughts drifted back over the 3-year period that had elapsed since he had been commissioned a captain in the Bombay Marine, sent out to rendezvous with that John Abercrombie, who had called himself Barbarossa, and deliver the ransom for Lind, the governor-designate of Madras. He remembered the rain and then the blinding heat at Vellore during the mutiny, the bloody encounter with Tipu Sultan, who aspired to become Emperor of India. He cringed inwardly as he thought of the useless deaths of Sister Jeanne and Midshipman Bertram. The memory of the long voyage, the engagement with the Maguindanao pirates at Ainurang, and the landing in forbidden Canton to force the issuance of Grand Chop, was overshadowed by the bitter recollection of his trial before a court of inquiry at Bombay Castle the year before last, though he had been most honourably acquitted. Caroline made a tentative sound, and Merewether looked up. "What did you say?" She hesitated, eyes fixed on her work, and then said in a strained voice, "Nothing." He was sure she had started to say something and then thought better of it. Damnation! Women! He picked up the beaker at his elbow and sniffed the aroma of the Spanish brandy, took a bare sip, and looked back at the blurred page before he drifted into reverie again. Last year had offered no surcease. The long days and anxious nights as officer in tactical command of the Bengal squadron, the constant irritations inflicted by the unfortunate Captain Wolfe, and the fetid atmosphere of Penang. He still felt distaste for the place where he had been forced to fight a duel with that Royal Navy captain. What was his name? Ackroyd? Though that delightful pair Livy and Tom Raffles had entertained him royally. Then he had been inept enough to be knocked on the head and marooned on the Ile-de-France. He wondered how Eleanora, the Creole granddaughter of old Jamie Plantin, might be faring, and was reminded that he had not answered the letter from young Harris, posted in Boston early in the year, announcing his marriage to that proper New England maiden. Percival? Caroline was looking at him, her violet eyes swimming with tears again. Yes, my dear? I'm only being a silly woman, Percival. But do you love me? Why, certainly. Merewether was startled. This was the first such question in a year and a half of marriage. Had she somehow divined his lechery with Creusa? I sometimes think you love the Marine more than Robert or me. Nonsense, with relief. Caroline's head was now bowed again over her sewing. He waited uncomfortably a moment to see if she had more to say, then took another sip of the brandy and looked back at his book. A year ago he had come back to Calcutta thin and brown from his long ride along the Persian road, to find Caroline expecting their child. He had been happy and proud of the event, and thought he had made this clear to her. He wondered how Rob Percy and his bride Sally liked London by now, and was sure that beautiful, self-sufficient little woman would manage her affairs no matter where she might sojourn. This past year had been no better. The combined operations with the Royal Navy under the command of Commodore Dunbar, Colonel Lionel Smith and Captain Seaton had degenerated into an unpleasant squabble, though it had finally ended well enough with the destruction of Ras el Khaimah. With Rapid decommissioned, Merewether had found himself in command of Pitt, a 36-gun frigate, but sitting on a powder keg of mutiny inspired by a first lieutenant who understood only the cat and the rope. He winced as he remembered the men who had uselessly kicked their lives away in nooses, and finished off the brandy. Caroline remained intent on her work. The events of the past few months were too recent to dwell on. The horrendous frigate action last summer in the Gulf of Aden, when he had panicked and sought to strike his colours, and a fine young officer, John Dobbs, had died. He had come to terms with his conscience, but the event still troubled him, as did his recent adultery with Creusa Hale. The ill-advised occupation of Macao had resulted in almost the loss of the company's China trade, and another unpleasant encounter with the Select Committee at Canton. Why, then, did he vacillate? Must he pursue the bubble reputation into yet another and another cannon's mouth, until that round shop with his name etched upon it should inevitably strike him down? Merewether sat silent, staring at Caroline's red-gold hair gleaming in the lamplight, and knew that the decision had already been made for him. He could not renege on the vow he had made as penance for his sins. He laid the book aside and rose to find paper, pen, and ink. Merewether signed his name, sprinkled sand over the wet ink, and poured the surplus back into the bowl. He looked up at the commencement again, addressed by way of the Master Attendant, Calcutta, and the Commandant to the Superintendent of the Bombay Marine. The first two were immediately available, Commodore Land at the dockyard and Commodore Sir John Waldron in his flagship still anchored in the Hooghly. It would take a bit longer for the request to reach Sir James Campbell at Bombay for final action, but the deed was done. He heard the querulous wail from the next room and the rustle as Caroline moved to the crib. George Robert Percival at 7 months did not thrive. He suffered from the prickly heat and had scratched his tiny body into a mass of raw skin in spite of the flannel mittens now covering his hands. He heard Caroline crooning to the baby, and in a moment she brought him in, the child's yellow hair gleaming in the light. "Hold him a moment, Percival. I must get his barley water." He took the infant awkwardly, marvelling again at the bright blue eyes that peered out over the red irritated cheeks. The itch must be intolerable, though the apothecary had prepared a nostrum that appeared to give some relief. He saw Caroline's face as she brought the cup. The fair English complexion had browned and coarsened this past year in the heat of the Bengal climate, and in another year her beauty would be irretrievably lost. "He appears more comfortable," he said tentatively, "not trying to scratch just then." She took the boy back to his crib, where he subsided quietly. "Here it is," said Merewether, handing over the letter. He was clearly entitled to it by regulation, after 10 continuous years of commissioned service in the Marine, 3 years' leave with pay. He had completed the 10 years last September, but until now had been unable to bring himself to write the formal request. "Oh, Percival, at last!" Caroline's face shone, and she leaned over to kiss him upon the cheek. "And I shall see James again, and you will meet the family." Last month, the proceeds of the prizes taken only 2 years ago in the Bay of Bengal had been paid off, and only yesterday his share of the schooner in which he had escaped from Mauritius. The 3 French frigates taken at Aden last summer had been purchased into the Royal Navy for £170,000, but payment of the prize money had to come from London. He had a bill exchange drawn on the company treasurer for the proceeds of the taels he had received from the Viceroy of Canton. He could hardly plead poverty. When all his accounts were settled, he should have enough capital to live comfortably the rest of his life, and he had been promised a substantial reduction in passage money by the master of the Star of Greenwich, now anchored down at Budge. But the Marine had been his life. Could he retire to some peaceful spot in England? He thought not, already beginning to resent the waste of time with the operations against Mauritius and Java still pending though postponed. It was an awkward time to take leave. Rumour had it that 3 commodores would retire this year, and James had died at Surat. Attrition in the upper half of the captain's list had been even more severe, and he was almost 2/3 of the way up it by now. On leave, he would stand little chance for promotion, and the 2 operations promised opportunities to distinguish himself and earn more prize money. But Caroline and Robert were more important, he told himself as he dropped off to sleep. The next morning Land looked keenly at him and endorsed the request, forwarded, approved, and handed it back. "You may deliver it to Waldron." They piped the side for Merewether in Pitt as he came on board, and he looked about the familiar decks. When last he saw her, she was a battered hulk in the graving dock at Bombay, but Jamsetji had made her whole again. She had a new captain, and none of his officers was left aboard, but he returned the salutes of some of his old hands. Bartram, he had heard, had departed for England with his family last month. His tour of duty in the Marine ended. Archer, the flag lieutenant, took him into the cabin, and Waldron rose, extending his hand. There was casual chit-chat while the steward poured the coffee. Merewether had not seen the commandant since that morning in this same cabin when he was ordered to Mauritius to rescue a detachment of Marines. Yes, I remember you went up in Persia last year with some Foreign Office bloke that lost his leg. But I haven't had the chance to read your report since then." He looked directly at Merewether. "And now, what can I do for you, Captain?" He handed the request to Waldron. "Well, I'm damned. Has it been 10 years? Seems like yesterday you were a boatswain's mate standing before the examining board trying to give an answer to Rumline Smith." He laid the request on his desk and looked out the port. "Now, you are entitled to this leave, Merewether, and I won't even have you wait on Bombay to act." He looked back and continued. "But I hope you have considered the fact that 3 retirements next month, plus the death of James, make 4 vacancies in the Commodore's list. You are more than halfway up the captain's list, and the selection board is authorized to pass over some more senior officers and reach down to you." He was now looking intently into Merewether's eyes. "I am chairman of the board, and I promise you will be selected if you remain on duty." Merewether absorbed the statement. It was a dazzling prospect. He would be the youngest permanent Commodore since Jenkins over 70 years ago. Then the vision of his tortured son, scratching futilely with his mittened hands, and Caroline, her fair complexion weathered to the colour and texture of saddle leather like some of those old company widows still living out here, swam into his mind. He had promised her, and he could not renege. "Sir, I am appreciative beyond my ability to express, but I am compelled to take this leave." Waldron did not argue. "I'll see this taken care of at Bombay Castle, and good luck, Captain." The Star of Greenwich sailed 3 days later to call at Madras, in spite of the fact that at this season it was a lee shore without shelter in the open roads from the northeast monsoon, and the vessel's insurance would be voided during its stay there. It was a pleasant 6-day cruise. Merewether had forgotten how leisurely and comfortable life was in an Indiaman, and they had a large airy cabin on the starboard side of the main deck. Captain Allison had been third mate of the old Dunvegan Castle, and flattered Merewether by professing to remember him as a boy in that ship. The prickly heat faded from Robert's small body. Caroline's complexion began to brighten in the fresh sea air. They came to anchor in the early morning of Christmas Eve in the roadstead with another anchor dropped underfoot, and then carried out a third from the stern to leeward. The 5th mate and quartermaster was stationed at the binnacle, taking continuous bearings on the tower of Fort St. George and a spire over in the town, lest the ship drag and strand on this lee shore. "We'll not depart before late afternoon," Captain Allison told him. "I have a considerable shipment to load from lighters. Plenty of time for Mrs. Merewether to visit her aunt and uncle." There was a stage rigged over the side with a regular staircase leading down to it. Merewether carried the child and steadied Caroline as they went down to embark in one of the shore boats. Lady Barlow was ecstatic. She snatched the child and cuddled him in her arms. Merewether hovered in the background as the 2 women exchanged obstetrical details. "I'll go and call on Sir George," he told them. "Still quite a while before lunch." He walked over to Government House, remembering the brisk young captain who had presided there during Bentinck's tenure. But Locksley was in the anteroom now, and he was greeted with professional warmth. "The governor will be delighted to see you, Captain." Then led him into the chamber where he had met Lord William Bentinck that rainy afternoon nearly 3 years ago, before he commenced his journey to Vellore and the confrontation with Tipu Sultan. He thought of young Bertram lying over in that grave at Fort St. George, now merely an incident of the mission. "Why, Merewether, this is an unexpected pleasure." Sir George rose and came around the desk to shake his hand. It's been 1.5 years, I think. And how are Caroline and George?" The 3 Christian names the child had been baptized with offered his relatives a choice as to which they preferred, Merewether thought with amusement. "Fine, sir. They are with Lady Barlow now." "What? Did you come on the Star of Greenwich?" "Yes, sir, going back to England on leave." "Well, I'm damned." "Oh, last October a marine ship left some mail here to be forwarded to Calcutta for you. At this season, of course, we haven't had the opportunity." He tinkled the bell, and Locksley popped in. "That mail for Captain Merewether, please." There were 3 items. 2 appeared to be routine marine communiques, but the 3rd was wrapped and sealed for transmission by the overland mail. The device in the seal was somehow familiar. And then he remembered. "Go ahead and read them. I've some dispatches I can be signing for the Star of Greenwich to take along." He slit the wrapper and took out a single sheet. It was dated the previous June. "My dear Merewether, we had a long, slow passage to London with almost a month at St. Helena while a topmast was replaced. Carpenter Wiley made me a handsome peg, silver-mounted, before we left Viper. I can now walk almost as well as before, and shall ride in the Ardsley hunt next fall. Sally is fine, and we expect a child early in the new year. Grenville and King George's Equerry have confirmed the fact. I shall be created Baron Percy of Baku in the New Year's honours list. I chose the title to memorialise that expensive Caspian naval engagement, and to distinguish me from the Baron Percy who is my nephew. Oh, and I have confirmed with the same authorities that you will be created a Knight of the Bath for services to government, not company. So you may call yourself Sir Percival come January, though there will have to be a bit of ritualistic flummery at some time. If you're in London, Sally and I shall welcome you, and my warmest regards to Caroline. Ever yours, A.R. Percy." "Well, I'm damned," said Merewether with wonder. "What?" Sir George looked up sharply. "Bad news?" Merewether handed him the letter, and Barlow looked first at the signature, then sniffed. "Oh, that Foreign Office fellow lost a leg up in Persia 1 year or so ago, I heard." He perched spectacles on his nose and read the letter. "Baron Percy of Baku? What did he do?" "Stopped off Boney from invading India." "I thought Boy Malcolm did that." He read on. "Knight of the Bath. Good God, Merewether, what did you do?" "Helped Percy, sir." "Well, congratulations, Sir Percival. Locksley, we have a Knight of the Bath here." Luncheon on a terrace overlooking Madras roadstead was delightful. Toasts in champagne to the new Sir Percival and Lady Merewether, and Sir George actually dandling the child on his knee. They came back to the Star of Greenwich in the late afternoon. Caroline and Merewether each a little tipsy still with the champagne they had drunk, and Master Robert asleep in his mother's arms. The stern anchor and the one underfoot had been taken in, and the stream anchor was at short stay. The ship was under way, a quarter of an hour later, steering south towards the Indian Ocean and the Cape of Good Hope. Caroline was nursing the child in the cabin, while Merewether remained on the quarter-deck watching lights come on over in Madras. He had given the Crown, the Company, and the Marine 19 years of his life, and he would only be 31 next week. They had been good to him in their fashion, and he had tried to give value in return, but he felt somehow in his bones that he would not pass this way again. He turned to join Caroline and their son. This concludes For King and Company by Ellis K. Meacham, narrated by Stephen Crossley. a member of SAG-AFTRA. Copyright 1976 by Ellis K. Meacham. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Thunderchild Publishing and was produced in the year 2017 by Tantor Media Incorporated, a division of Recorded Books, which holds the copyright thereto. Please visit Tantor.com for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks and to take advantage of special offers.